Have you planted a meadow or pollinator planting on your property? Or do you know someone or someplace in your community that has one? If it's on your property, then part of the recommended management for it may have been to mow it periodically. Or if it's not on your property, then you may have driven by it only to see it being mowed or find that it had recently been mowed. If your initial reaction was something along the lines of, what, wait, stop, no, why? Or included feelings of confusion, sadness, anger, or frustration, then you aren't alone. In this episode, we're going to talk about why people mow meadows and larger pollinator plantings. We'll also talk about whether it is really necessary. Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their monthly donations help cover the costs of hosting and producing Backyard Ecology. If you would like to join them, you can do so for less than the cost of a cup of coffee or a meal at your favorite fast food place. I'll have links in the show notes for the Backyard Ecology Patreon page, blog, YouTube channel, and email list. Also, during the month of January 2023, we are asking everyone in the Backyard Ecology audience to help us out by taking a short 4-question survey. If you've already taken the survey, thank you. If you haven't taken it, please do so. Your answers will help guide future Backyard Ecology content. In fact, today's episode was partially inspired by some early answers to the survey. Who knows, maybe one of your answers will inspire a future episode, article, or video. The survey will only be available through the end of January 2023. I'll have a link in the show notes for it. Prairies, grasslands, meadows, pollinator plantings, whatever you want to call those open fields of native grasses and native wildflowers that many people are planting, provide important habitat for many different animals. We've talked in previous episodes about how birds that depend on grasslands and grassland-related habitats are some of our fastest declining species. And there's no denying the positive impacts that those areas can have on the local pollinator population. The list of the benefits that these types of plantings can have, when done in the right location, of course, can go on and on. So why in the world would anyone who cares enough to plant one want to mow it down? In some ways, it sounds crazy to even think about it. I mean, you've worked so hard and invested so much to create such a beautiful, healthy ecosystem that nurtures so much life. Why would you ever consider mowing it all down and destroying everything that you've created? Before we can answer that question, we need to take a step back and discuss the prairie or grassland ecosystems that we are trying to replicate with these types of plantings. Prairies and grasslands typically occur due to either environmental factors, disturbance factors, or some combination of environmental and disturbance factors. Environmental factors are at play when the location favors the growth of grasses and herbaceous flowering plants over the growth of trees. For example, maybe the soils are too shallow and rocky to allow trees to grow very well in those locations. Or maybe the climate is on the drier side, not so dry as to create a desert, but not so wet as to produce lush forest growth either. Disturbance factors, like environmental factors, can come in many different forms. Disturbance factors are also really interesting because they can keep an area as a prairie or grassland, even when the environmental conditions could technically support a forest. One way of phrasing it would be to say that disturbance factors disrupt and set back ecological succession. We'll talk more about that and whether or not it is a good thing towards the end of this episode. However, the important point right now is that it doesn't matter how much rain an area gets or how deep the soils are. that area will never turn into a forest if it continues to be repeatedly disturbed in some way that results in few, if any, saplings surviving to grow up into big trees. Historically, one common disturbance factor was large grazing and browsing animals. The first example that always pops into my mind for this type of disturbance is the bison. And yes, there were bison in parts of the East, even though we typically think of them as Western species. You can imagine the amount of disturbance that even a small herd of animals, each weighing between 750 and 2,000 pounds, could cause as they grazed through an area or even just rolled in the dirt to scratch an itchy back or rub off shedding fur. It's not just everything they would eat either. They would also be trampling and crushing saplings, scuffing and turning up the ground as they walked or ran, moving seeds that were stuck in their fur or in the mud on their hooves, and just creating all kinds of other disturbances. Fire was another common disturbance factor that often helped create and maintain grasslands and prairies. Fires could be started by lightning strikes or by indigenous people who we know used fire for thousands of years to manage the land for a variety of purposes. The fires would kill many of the trees and young saplings in the area. Exactly how many and what types of trees and young saplings were killed would depend on the frequency and intensity of the fires. The end result of the fires was a more open ecosystem than would have occurred without the fires. And those more open ecosystems were dominated by grasses and native wildflowers. Understanding the role of disturbance factors in forming and maintaining prairies or grasslands is important because in most of the East, we get more than enough rainfall to support tree growth. Now, in some places, there are other environmental factors at work that limit or reduce tree growth. But generally speaking, the environmental conditions over most of the eastern U.S. are perfectly capable of supporting trees. For us, disturbance factors, or disturbance factors in conjunction with environmental factors, were the driving force behind our grasslands or prairies. So once those disturbance factors stopped occurring, trees quickly grew up and replaced the prairies that had been there. So, back to the original question, why would anyone want to mow or recommend mowing a planted meadow or pollinator planting? The answer is because they are trying to introduce some form of a disturbance factor. The mowing itself isn't important. It's the disturbance that is important. Because without periodic disturbance, it is highly likely that the pollinator planting or meadow that you've worked so hard to create will revert to shrubby, scrubby type habitat within 5 to 10 years, then young forests, and within 30 years, it'll be woods with some potentially pretty decent-sized trees. In other words, the disturbance, whether it is mowing or something else, when done correctly, isn't destroying everything you've worked so hard to create. Instead, it is saving it. But why mowing? Well, first, I should probably note that mowing a meadow or pollinator planting isn't the same as mowing your yard. In this case, you are mowing for a very specific purpose, and you are doing it maybe once a year if the planting is well established, and you probably aren't mowing it as short as you would mow your yard. But the reason that mowing is so often recommended is from a purely practical standpoint. None of us in the East have wild herds of bison grazing through our yards, meadow, or pollinator plantings, so that form of disturbance isn't an option. There are some researchers and farmers who are looking at whether intensive rotational grazing of cattle can be used kind of as a bison substitute to maintain planted meadows and grasslands. From what I've heard, some places are getting really good results with this technique. But this isn't a turn the cows loose in the field and let them do their thing type scenario. There's a lot of management involved to make it work right. However, you need a good amount of land plus an interest in working cattle for that to be an option, which rules it out for most of us. Fire is often touted as the best form of disturbance that we can use to maintain herbaceous pollinator plantings or planted meadows, not to mention any prairie or grassland remnants that we might find. It is a very useful tool in the management toolbox, and when applied properly can have extremely beneficial results. However, again, it isn't practical in every situation. Yes, you can safely do small-scale prescribed burns in many situations. But if your meadow comes right up next to the house, I don't suggest trying to burn it. Plus, the regulations regarding who can burn what and when vary from one state to the next. In some states, it is relatively easy for a private landowner to use prescribed fire on their property. In other states, it is nearly impossible. And in many states, it is somewhere in between. The ability to hire a professional team to conduct a prescribed burn is also going to vary from one state to the next, not to mention from pocketbook to pocketbook for the landowner. Which is where mowing comes into the conversation. Mowing is a disturbance factor that pretty much anyone can do in pretty much any location. Even if your mower doesn't raise up high enough to mow at the recommended heights, a weed whacker could be used on smaller areas. Or you could rent a small push-behind bush hog or hire someone with a bush hog for not too much money to quickly mow the area. Mowing isn't going to have the same effects as fire or grazing, and it has its own potential side effects. But if that's your only option, then it'll do a better job of maintaining your meadow than not doing anything. Because remember, for most of the eastern U.S., not doing anything means that within a couple of decades, your meadow has completely vanished. Whatever disturbance factors you decide to use on your pollinator planting or meadow, I highly recommend first talking to one or more of your local conservation and resource management organizations or agencies that deal with grasslands and prairies. Examples of some of the organizations that you may want to contact include your local NRCS office or your state's Nature Conservancy chapter. If you're really lucky, then your state or a neighboring state may have an organization that specializes in grassland or prairie conservation. The reason I recommend talking to them first is because these types of agencies routinely manage grassland and prairie ecosystems in your area. So they will be able to give you the best advice specific to where you live about how often and when to do your management activities. That's important because how often and when you do things will have major impacts on the plant species that come back year after year in your meadow or prairie, and on the types of animals that are attracted to it. The deeper you dig into caring for and maintaining your meadow or pollinator planting, the more complicated it can get. Don't let that scare you off or stop you from doing anything. You can go as deep as you want or just barely scratch the surface if you prefer. But don't be afraid to ask for help from local specialists. Okay, now when I first started talking about disturbance factors, I said that one way of thinking about disturbance factors is that they disrupt and set back ecological succession. I also said that we'd talk more about that and whether it was a good thing towards the end of this episode. This is a discussion that I see come up time and time again. Someone will say something like, haven't we messed things up enough? Shouldn't we just get out of the way and let nature take its course? If it's supposed to grow up into trees and become a forest, then we should let it. That's natural succession. If that someone sounds like you, then please understand, I'm not putting you down or anything like that. I actually get where you're coming from. There was a time when I had very similar thoughts and feelings too. In many ways, for me, I think those thoughts and feelings stemmed from being taught at a very young age that disturbances in the environment were bad. But as I learned more about ecology and the way different ecosystems function, I discovered that's not always the case. In fact, in some cases, ecosystems may depend on and thrive on the correct types of disturbances. Those ecosystems may even cease to exist without the disturbances that they evolved with. Nowadays, for me, the question of natural succession and just letting nature take its course comes down to a series of philosophical questions. First, what constitutes letting nature take its course? Does that mean we reintroduce wild herds of bison to roam throughout the eastern U.S.? If so, what do we do with the forests that are here now but weren't here when the bison were here originally? And if your neighborhood has trouble with an overpopulation of deer eating everything, what's going to happen when a herd of bison come through? Does letting nature take its course mean letting any wildfires that start burn freely, no matter what that means for the homes and businesses that might be in the fire's path? What if the wildfire starts to go into an area that we know probably didn't used to burn very often, if it ever burned? Also, can you make a distinction between wildfires set by lightning and those set by people, when we know that indigenous tribes were using fire to manage the landscape for thousands of years? The question of what constitutes letting nature take its course quickly becomes very complicated when you think about everything that has changed over the past few centuries. You don't have to judge whether those changes are good or bad to recognize that they exist. We simply live in a very different world than existed 300 or 400 years ago. Which leads me to the philosophical question of, can natural succession really exist in an ecosystem where we have artificially removed the natural disturbances that had previously maintained that system? Or is it okay for us to simulate those disturbances to the best of our ability so that an ecosystem can survive and function as well as possible? I'm going to leave it to you to think about and come up with your own answers to all those questions. Like most philosophical questions, they aren't always easy ones to answer, and the answers may change depending on the situation. But I think they are questions that are worth considering and worth thinking through and considering the consequences of the answers that you come up with. I hope you found this episode helpful and that it has encouraged you to think about things. If you're listening to this in January of 2023, please don't forget to take our survey. Again, the link is in the show notes. And until next time, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.